Okay. All right. Excellent. So first of all, thank you all for the invitation. I know it's been a while trying to organize this. I think for over a year, Peter. So I'm really happy that we finally, were able to make it work. The title of my talk is Hunt, Gather, Give, the Why Behind the Way. And as the title suggests, I'll be discussing motivations for foraging and sharing food in the Hadza, who are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, meaning that the majority of the foods or the calories that they get, they come from hunted and foraged foods. And the paper that I'm presenting really involves the labor and intellect of two former postdocs of mine who, and I say this with all sincerity, did the majority of the heavy lifting on this project. And in particular, Duncan here, this project was his baby, but both of them are absolutely fantastic and they're both on the job market right now. Okay, so I know there's a lot of Europeans here, but American Thanksgiving is around the corner. It's actually this week, this Thursday. It's a time that is synonymous with communal eating, generosity, and it just seemed, fitting to discuss food sharing in humans. So food sharing, it's an activity that spans across all cultures. It's a cornerstone of our social existence, and it's for communal eating as well. Obviously, Americans didn't invent Thanksgiving, but we probably did invent the elastic waistband to accommodate all the food that we typically eat on Thanksgiving. Food sharing is widespread. It extends beyond the familiar faces of family and friends. It includes strangers. So a touching example of this that I just found occurred last winter in Buffalo, New York, when a South Korean tour group's van became stranded in the snow during a blizzard. And what they did is they walked to the nearest house to ask for help and calling a tow truck and, figuring out a hotel that they could stay in. And the family there was like, no, it's too dangerous to go out. And besides, tomorrow's Christmas. So stay with us. And together, what they did is they prepared a big Christmas meal using all the food that they could find in the pantry and fridge. And this act of food sharing, it not only provided sustenance, but it also fostered this really powerful bonding experience between them. And they now have become friends, and the Americans have gone to Seoul to visit them, and they view the event as something that they, in their words, say was meant to be. And even when resources are scarce, so in times of disaster, for instance, people still manage to share food. So after the devastating earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan in 2011, there were many food initiatives, food sharing initiatives that emerged. So for instance, food banks were set up with many thousands of people volunteering to prepare and distribute food. Temporary housing communities were set up for people who had lost their homes. And often people wanted communal rather than personal kitchens. And so those were established where residents could cook and eat together. And even corporations, they did their parts as well. So for instance, vending machine companies set their machines to dispense free food. And now just this summer, Japan has set up vending machines that automatically offer free food in times of disaster. So it is really striking that food sharing is so widespread in humans, even during hardship, when you consider that most other animals, they fight over food. So luckily what that means for us at, American Thanksgiving is that instead of fighting over food, we get to fight over politics. So this is an onion diagram that I like, showing how different primate species share food. It's based on research by Adrian Yagi and Carol Van Schaik. And what they found is basically what they did is they cataloged the behavior of 68 different primate species. And they found that for 40% of species, there was no sharing of food at all. 60% of species do share food with their young. It's usually mothers and their offspring. And within that group, about 45% will also share some food among adults. However, humans stand out as the only species with widespread food sharing. You can also categorize the different types of food transfers observed in primates. So this is work that involved, compiling, these published descriptions of food transfer types from various studies. And so they've cataloged them based on the different types. So what you have, the most rare form is proactive transfers. So those are in green. And this occurs when the individual who has the food initiates the transfer by either approaching another individual or calling another individual over to share the food. And you see that in humans. You then have reactive transfers, and this happens in response to certain behaviors from others that lead to the transfer of food. So this can include like actions like just asking for the food or begging for the food. Passive transfers, these are becoming more common now. And in this scenario, what happens is the food owner allows others to take the food. They don't facilitate the taking. They don't try to stop the taking. They're generally passive in that. Then there are forced transfers, and as the name suggests, this type involves forcibly taking food despite some resistance from the owner. And then in the maroon here, you have resisted transfers, meaning that the owner was successful in resisting the transfer of food. So you can compare humans here. These are children on the right, where you can see there's a lot of proactive, reactive, and passive sharing compared to our closest relatives, the apes here, where there is both resisted and forced sharing, but very little, proactive sharing. And the callitrichids here are, just really a special case. These are the New World monkeys, including marmosets and tamarins. And many of you know twinning is very common. It's actually the norm rather than the exception. And this just places really high energetic demands on the mother as she, needs substantial resources to raise, two offspring simultaneously. And so lactation falls short of that, and she needs to rely on others, in particular the father, to care for infants. So just to summarize, food sharing among primates who are not related, and even just beyond mother-offspring pairs, it's uncommon. When it does happen, though, it's usually passive rather than proactive. So, for example, in chimpanzees, a lot of food sharing is just driven by the desire to avoid harassment from others who want the food. But when chimpanzees do proactively share food, it's mainly with kin and reciprocating partners. And this is behavior that, of course, contrasts with humans, where widespread food sharing is common. So beyond, its uniqueness, why study food sharing? Well, it's, as I mentioned, it's a human universal. It's a fundamental aspect of hunter-gatherer social life, economic life. And not only is it a central feature of life, but it's an essential feature in that there is interdependence among individuals. And then the practice of food sharing has been, linked to important aspects of human evolution. So it's thought to have evolved in tandem with our unique life history and our foraging niche. So food sharing has supported, our extended childhoods with this prolonged period of nutritional dependence that you get, a need that's met through communal sharing by non-parental adults, by other children, and so on. And then our foraging niche is one that's really skill intensive, meaning that adolescents and even young adults, they need to rely on others for food while they master, these complex skills that are needed for foraging. So early life in hunter-gatherers is often characterized by a deficit in production. And then later in life, it's characterized by a surplus. And then finally, food sharing may hold clues to the evolution of our cooperative psychology more generally. So many believe that food sharing in humans, it was the precursor to our more, general cooperative nature, in that it helped shape the evolution and development of our moral and cooperative psychology. So why study food sharing in hunter-gatherers then? Well, at one point, all humans made a living by hunting game and gathering wild plant foods, which means that extant, hunter-gatherer societies, they offer us this valuable window into ancestral behaviors. And it's reasonable to suggest that our sharing psychology that we have evolved primarily within, the context of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, with the adaptive problems that food sharing, solved within that setting. So for instance, resource variability is a problem, resource uncertainty, and so forth. And so by understanding why and how hunter-gatherers share food, it may offer us insights that are applicable to understanding even cooperative behavior in people in other societies and other contexts. Okay, so how generous is generous when we're talking about food sharing? Well, people, and I'm largely talking about the Hadza today, but some of these can be generalized, that this is the population that I know the most about because it's the one that I work with. But basically what happens is people spend hours each day collecting food, but often that food is freely given away within the group. But even still, even though we can agree on that, there are unsettled debates about, well, how much food is actually redistributed beyond immediate families. So for example, researchers like Kristen Hawkes and Nick Blair-Jones, they found that hunters' families don't keep a larger share of the meat compared to any other household. So they're not getting more compared to anybody else. But then there's research by Brian Wood and the late Frank Marlowe that suggests otherwise. So they say that, hunters' household, they end up with about 42% of the meat. So they get a greater share than other households. But then that research has been criticized by Hawkes and others, and there's just been so much back and forth. So they say they were critical of the way that they calculated meat sharing. So they said that you only looked at meat sharing back when it arrived back in camp, but not at the site, where it actually happened, where the kill actually happened. They included animal skins in their calculations, which are usually kept by the hunter's family, but for warmth, not for food. So lots of back and forth, a lot of debate. But despite these debates, it's generally agreed that a greater proportion of meat is shared rather than kept by the producer and the household. So they're still giving away more than they are keeping for themselves. How much more? Again, up for grabs. And what's more is across many forager societies, men and women collect entirely different sets of resources. So there's a sexual division of labor. So with, some exceptions, women tend to target, more reliable, smaller package size resources like plants and fruits and nuts. And men tend to go after resources which are less reliably acquired, like large game. So these are, high yield, but also high variance resources. And what's more is that the foods that men target are the ones that are more widely shared. So these are, behaviors, they're puzzles. After investing a lot of time and a lot of energy in acquiring food, why would individuals choose to share it? And then why do men, pursue different resource types? And in particular, why do men target foods that they know are just going to go to other people? These questions are itself has been explored in evolutionary game theory beginning, in the 1970s, primarily to understand animal gatherers. These, as I said, are ongoing debates. There have been lots of studies, lots of publications, but there's really still no consensus for stabilizing food sharing. There is, however, consensus that food sharing does act as a form of risk mitigation. So this is the idea that, sharing resources can help individuals manage uncertainty and variability that's inherent in foraging and in hunting. So we know that those activities are risky. So just to give you an example, among the Hadza hunters, so it's very low. Success is very low. And so all members just really do better by pooling their resources, and they're going to have a food supply. And of course, there is a lot of different ways that you can mitigate risk. You can have norms and rules to, always share, any food that comes in, or just to give to people who need would do this as well. But still, the evolutionary, processes required to stabilize sharing are still debated. And some of them may functionally reduce risk. Maybe even all of them in some way will do that. But some are more explicitly, compatible with that, such as reciprocity. So they'll make claims about that. So let me just give you a quick theoretical models that have been argued for explaining and sharing in foragers. So the first explanation is the tolerated theft hypothesis, which was really championed by Nick Blurt in the late 1980s as an explanation for food sharing in the Hadza. And this theory is derived directly from game theory models, in particular the hawk-dove game. People have diminishing returns to the owner as they become full. Who does not have any food and that is hungry, right? The subjective value of the food is going to be higher and they're going to be more willing to find that. This scenario becomes more pronounced as the food packages become larger and more rare, which is the case with big game hunting. So in this situation, the food owner is more likely to share it, to act dove-like, so as to avoid conflict from those who are more willing to fight for it and act like hawks. So the basic idea here is that we share food because of peer demands, complaints, requests that people make. So people give or let others take food for them to reduce the costs of having to defend the food in the first place. And in this model, overt conflicts really only happen when the subjective value of the food between the parties is similar to one another. So you don't really need to see a whole lot of fighting happening for demand sharing to be at play. Now, there's a lot of support for this explanation in our literature. So there's a lot of ethnographic evidence for, complaints and requests for food being really common. And sharing is also more common for large items. So we see it in particular for big game, right? And that's exactly what doesn't explain why people pursue those resources that they know will be widely shared in the first place, right? And this explanation is also observation that sharing is often predicated by other factors like kinship, reciprocity. And so critics of this theory of those other factors too. It just might be that there are additional benefits to sharing besides for avoiding conflict. Okay, the next explanation is family provisioning. And this is the idea that people forage food to provision themselves, to provision their families. And so this is kin selection. It's a very good explanation for explaining vertical transfers of food from older generations to younger generations within the same biological family, and then even horizontal transfers that occur, let's say, costs and benefits of sharing are assessed within the context of their genetic relatedness. And in this explanation, the sexual division of labor is viewed as cooperative. So spouses are working together, they're cooperating with one another to jointly provision their young, their children. And they're each targeting, different sets of foods, different macronutrients in the environment. And women are specializing in, activities that are compatible with childbearing and nursing, and men are specializing in other activities, riskier activities like hunting. And by sharing, they're also reducing some risk as well. But the idea is that they're maximizing their incomes, their foraging incomes, by cooperating with one another in order to support their families. Now, the provisioning family hypothesis does a really good job at explaining spousal sharing, kin sharing, and there's a lot of empirical support for this. We know individuals prefer to give food to their relatives. I've conducted some work with, honey stick donations, and we know that people are more likely to give honey to their relatives than to non-kin. So there's a lot of evidence for this. But as I mentioned, there is debate about how much hunted food goes to the producer's family. Measuring, as you already know, measuring food redistribution is really tricky. There's a lot of debate about how exactly it should be measured, and because it can be really rare for especially meat packages to come in by a particular individual of data to really get good estimates. So studies have tried to bypass this by looking at, for instance, the nutritional status of a hunter's family. Do they do better if they're a good hunter? And really the results are mixed there, where some studies find a relationship between hunting success and growth rates of, say, children, and others don't. A more recent study by Duncan Stibbert Hawkes, who's one of the authors of this paper that I'm presenting, he didn't find any relationship between men's hunting reputation and their spouse's hemoglobin concentration, which is basically thought of as a proxy for dietary red meat, suggesting that there's more generalized sharing than there is familial sharing. It's not really being picked up, at least in this blood test, when it comes to hunted food. So hunters may really not be benefiting from the food any more than anyone else. The provisioning hypothesis also does not explain why people share food with unrelated people outside of their household, right? And it doesn't explain why men often go after resources like large game, which they know are going to be shared beyond their household. So it's actually been argued that hunters could provide more calories and more consistently for their family if they just focused on smaller, more reliable sources of food that aren't shared as widely. So the fact that men are choosing to hunt large game, according to critics of this theory, it doesn't really fit with the idea that they're just doing it to provision. Okay, the next explanation, this is pretty simple, is reciprocity. This, just involves sharing food with others based on past interactions and the expectation of future exchanges. And this process explains food sharing among unrelated individuals, so that's useful. It helps mitigate risk more widely, also useful. And there's just been a lot of empirical support for this as well. So it's been observed that food transfers are often biased towards those who have previously shared with a donor. Mike Gerben and Adrian Yagi, they conducted a meta-analysis to test for overall effects of reciprocity on food sharing, and they did this with, I think, 16 different forager societies. The HUDs are included in this data, and they found moderate correlations between the effect of receiving food or some other commodity on sharing food. Standard criticisms of reciprocity, reciprocal systems are vulnerable to cheating, so that, you need additional mechanisms to detect cheaters, punish cheaters. Because reciprocity also involves a time delay that introduces uncertainty, this can be especially problematic in fluid social environments like in mobile hunter-gatherers, where people are changing residence often. So this is really true of the Hadza. They're mobile foragers. And in some of my own work, where you track individuals going from one year to the next, you look to see who they're living with. They're only living with 1 in 5 of their prior camp mates from the year before. Right. And those are usually their relatives or spouse and so forth. So we know that reciprocity works really well when interactions are likely to be repeated in the long term. There are some criticisms that, it's cognitively demanding, requires, infeasible amounts of mental accounting and so forth. Reciprocity models here do not explicitly address the sex differences in the foods that men and women target. And then I think they also seem, insufficient for explaining, certain aspects of human, food sharing or human cooperation more generally. The fact that we, share so widely when we know a lot of other animals engage in reciprocal giving. So what really made humans unique here? And then finally, this theory, also true of the family provisioning theory, it really requires that the producers have control over how their food is distributed. So Kristen Hawkes and others argue that, large game is not the property of hunters, but rather it's a public good. And people are going to take it and they're going to scrounge it. So there's just a lot of debate over that too. So it requires producer control, just like in family provisioning as well. So let's just assume you don't have control over how food is distributed. Place. And this is where costly signaling, or what they call the show-off hypothesis, comes in. And this idea suggests that people, forage and share food, especially large food packages, as a way to advertise, otherwise hidden qualities about themselves. Maybe their skill, how skilled they are, their generosity or cooperative intent. And they do this to advertise to potential mates or even potential allies. So essentially, it's a form of social advertising to make these qualities, visible to others. So men are forsaking some calories in order to reveal information about themselves to third parties. And in doing so, they're gaining some fitness benefits, potentially reproductive benefits. Traditionally, costly signaling theories have instead, unlike the family provisioning theories, they instead frame the sexual division of labor as spousal conflict, not cooperation. So it does a good job explaining the sexual division of labor. And the idea here is that, men have more to gain from women than signaling. And so they're more likely to target widely shared, attention-grabbing foods at the expense of provisioning their families. Whereas reproductively, women just have less to gain from that type of signaling. And in support of this hypothesis, there's, ample evidence that good hunters have greater fitness in many societies, including the Hadza. But of course, there are other reasons why those correlations could exist as well. If you're getting a lot of food, you're probably in better condition and so forth. So there are other reasons for those, and your family probably are getting direct benefits too. So again, this is, something that's debated. There are criticisms of this theory too. Some critics have highlighted that, it's just really difficult to prove signaling hypotheses empirically. So finding positive evidence that hunting acts as this costly signal is really difficult. Hunting is something that may not be entirely opaque either, because there's so much, as I mentioned, unpredictability in acquiring big game. The signal is not thought to be reliable. Though studies have found hunting reputation to be correlated with measures of hunting success. So for instance, upper body strength, for instance, that is one example. So men with stronger upper bodies or greater upper body strength, they have reputations for being better hunters. But again, that's something that is visible. You can generally get a good idea of how strong somebody is just by looking at them. And then more recent work has proposed that, women might actually benefit from signaling as well. It's not just men. So for instance, researchers have said that there are links between, female foraging ability and the likelihood of them being named as friends by others. So women's work too could advertise really or signal important qualities. And so why aren't men doing these activities? Okay, as I mentioned, this is something that is, difficult to prove empirically, but we just had a paper come out recently this year where what we did is we tested whether Hadza adults would choose to showcase their foraging skills at the expense of calories. So we asked 196 Hadza adults if they wanted to play two I call them carnival-like games, like if you go to a carnival or amusement park. One was a search game, one was an aim game, and these are games really designed to mimic their foraging and hunting abilities. So in the search game, they had to locate a specific colored bead within a larger bowl of beads or bucket of beads within a specified amount of time, and then they would win. And then in the aim game, it was basically a dart game where they had to hit a bullseye in order to win. And they could play the game up to 4 times. And what we did is we varied the incentive structure of both games, adjusting whether there was a caloric cost to play. So in this case, they had to pay with sticks of honey in order to play, or not, or it could also be free, or whether, success in the game was rewarded with a prize, a colored bracelet, which functioned as a visible, signal of success in the game. And essentially what we found was mixed support for costly signaling here. So as expected, we found that game conditions offering prizes were just more popular than those without, although this trend wasn't true for men in the paid aim game, which is where we expected perhaps it to matter the most. People were also much more likely to play the games when they were free as well. But here's the kicker. A significant majority of participants, about 3/4 of them, were just reluctant to pay, to sacrifice caloric resources to play either game. So in the cost condition, when it costs something, most participants, 75%, are like, no, I'm keeping my honey. I don't want to play. And this figure here on the right provides just the raw frequencies of total paid attempts in both of the games in the paid condition with prizes, right? So most people just don't want to give up honey. And when they do, it's just generally one stick. That said, though, we did observe a slight gender difference in the likelihood of playing the games. So men were more inclined to play the aim game here, and that's in the kind of like the orange color, in the paid round. So these are all the costly rounds. So this figure just plots the absolute difference in the probability of playing any given round, moving from female to male for all of the costly games. So you can see. And we broke it down by older and younger participants as well. And so younger men also were slightly more likely to play. So again, mixed evidence for costly signaling. Most of the time, people don't want to give up calories, but men are more willing to give up calories than women in order to play. Okay, so in short, I hope I convinced you that there's just been a huge research interest in understanding the motives underlying foraging and sharing decisions. There's just not been a lot of consensus, though. And evolutionary researchers, they've done everything, really. There's just like a lot of different methodologies have been used to investigate these motives. Studies have, drawn on cross-cultural data, cross-sectional data, social network data, field experiments, and so on. Just really everything under the sun, except for one thing. And that's just asking people directly about their motivations. So, of course, psychologists, economists, and now more recently, anthropologists, we approach self-report data with caution. And there are reasons why we approach it with caution. There are limitations associated with this method of data collection. The most obvious I listed here, social desirability bias. Individuals just might want to look good in front of the questioner, the researcher. And so they may alter their responses. Recall bias, just not remembering events. Response biases. People just might consistently agree with statements. That's what we call acquiescence bias, or choosing just the middlemost option. We're going to come back to acquiescence bias in a moment, actually. One that may be more relevant here as well is the lack of introspective, accuracy or awareness. So people may not have good insights into their own behaviors and motives. And then finally, also, something that we need to take into consideration, especially in cross-cultural research, is the misinterpretation of questions. Participants may not interpret, questions the same way that, researchers intended them to interpret them. So due to these limitations, researchers are shying away from this very basic methodology. However, talking to participants is very common in other parts of research that we do in the social sciences. We love, maybe economists less so, but we love quoting participants to provide anecdotal support for our research. We conduct post-experiment interviews to find out exactly what participants were thinking. And then anthropology itself historically has, drawn heavily on ethnography, which often uses participant observation to interact and talk with people to really figure out what's happening. And despite some limitations, there are benefits as well of using self-report data. So I've listed a few here, and I want to revisit this at the end of the presentation, but it's really the only method that provides direct access to, individuals' subjective experiences and beliefs. Self-report data also can help researchers gain insights into, cultural and social norms and practices that they might not have known about or just might not be observable through external measures. And it's also just a really, it's cost effective. It's a less time consuming, way to gather information or test things compared to other, methods like experimental approaches, or by just tracking long-term, food redistribution patterns. That's something that's really difficult. And then finally, it can empower participants by giving them agency in the research process. And again, we'll come back to that later. But for whatever reason, we've done everything except just ask them directly why they hunt and why they forage. So that's what I want to present to you today. A very simple back to basics study, a systematic quantitative assessment of foraging and sharing motives from the perspective of foragers themselves. So we conducted the study with the Hadza, who I mentioned are one of the last remaining populations of hunter-gatherers in existence today. They reside in northern Tanzania. There are about 1,000 individuals who identify as Hadza, but only 400 or so are still subsisting primarily by means of, hunting and gathering. And it's that smaller subset or the subgroup that is the focus of what I'll be talking about today. The Hadza live in camps that number about 30 individuals or so. But as I said, camp membership is fluid. Camps also, people can move between camps, and then camps themselves grow and shrink in size. And camps themselves also move, right? So entire camps will move and shift location as they use up resources in the area. And then food acquisition, again, characterized by a sexual division of labor. Men target animal-based resources, birds, antelope, giraffe. They'll collect honey. And then women target plant-based foods. They'll gather berries, dig for tubers. And gathering, I'll just say last thing, gathering is generally done in groups where hunting is more of a solitary activity. So it's been estimated that about 10% of hunting forays involve more than two people. So most of the time, 90% of the time, individuals are going out hunting alone. Okay, our aim was really simple. We wanted to ask people directly what motivates them to forage, either to go out and hunt or to go out and gather. It depends if you're talking to men or women. And then what motivates them to share outside of their household. And we also wanted to find out whether foragers, endorse the motives that, theorists have just, attributed to them. And if so, which did they think were more important? So we first went through, we combed through the literature, we identified, the most common explanatory motives. I shared most of them with you today. There's a couple of extra on here, like I'll share because the food will rot if I don't share. And some motives only made sense for foraging, and some only made sense for sharing. So for instance, sharing food because it's going to rot makes sense, but I hunt because food is going to rot does not make sense. And then similarly, like family provisioning and self-provisioning really only made sense for foraging decisions. Why do you go out to hunt? Why do you go out to gather? It didn't make sense for sharing because the way we defined sharing was sharing outside the household, sharing beyond your spouse and your children. So we ended up with 7 foraging motives and 7 sharing motives with some overlap between them. And to facilitate comprehension, we, created these simple illustrations, many of which you've already seen, with the help of science animation for each of our motive categories. So these depicted, Hadza people in Hadza clothing with Hadza foods. We had 18 different illustrations in total. I've included, you can see 6 examples of them here. And with few exceptions, for example, food will rot here. The pictures were gendered such that when we were interviewing, women about their motives, there were women in the pictures doing those activities. And we were interviewing men, there were men in the pictures doing those activities. Okay, the research was conducted just before the pandemic in the fall of 2019. And again, as I mentioned, we only conducted the research in bush camps where participants are habitually foraging. We interviewed 110 people, 56 were men, all adults 18 to 70 years old. And we used 4 different methods. So we started with a free response task where we just asked people to explain in their own words what motivated them to forage and what motivated them to share food beyond their household. After this, we conducted a yes/no task where we explained each motive along with the illustration and asked people whether or not it ever applied to them. Is this a reason why you go out hunting? Is this a reason why you go out foraging? We next conducted a ranking task where we explained each motive illustration again and asked participants to choose the top 3 most important. And then a series of forced choice tasks where we showed pairs of motives side by side and asked them to choose the one that was most important. And we conducted 2 rounds. First, we did all of the foraging questions. Then we did all of the sharing motive questions. And then the ranking data and the forced choice data were analyzed with binomial logistic regression using the Bayesian regression models package in R. And there are lots of models in the paper. I'm not going to report them all here. So I'm just really giving you the basic findings here. Okay, so for the free response task, we first just asked people in your own words these 2 questions. You know, every day you go out to get food. What primarily motivates you to hunt or to women to gather? And then what primarily motivates you to give food to people who are not your wife and your children or your husband and your children? And then we categorize their responses. There's about 93% agreement between author categorizations and a research assistant's categorizations. So here are their responses. So the first question we can ask is, well, do participants endorse the motives that have been ascribed to them by theorists? And so here are the results for foraging and then for sharing below here. And yes, the majority of key theory-derived motives were, mentioned independently by at least one participant. The other thing to notice is there was just a lot more reasons. Greater number of motivations were provided for sharing. Why do they share with outside their household versus why do they hunt or gather? Now, it should be noticed that the most that in this free response task, the most common explanation for why they forage were just simple proximate explanations, which is a limitation of this type of data collection. So why do you get food? Well, I get food. Or why do you forage? Well, I forage to get food, or I hunt to get meat. Or even proximate explanations like I hunt because I'm hungry, or I forage because I'm hungry, or it tastes good. So those were the primary ones. But beyond that, family provisioning came out on top, and it was mentioned by 25% of participants. For sharing, though, why do you share beyond your household? The most common answers were appeals to virtue, personal virtue. I share food because I am a good person. So they're motivated by their character. I have a good heart. That was another common one. Friendship, reciprocity, helping those in need were mentioned by about 10 to 15% of participants in each of the time for each. So I share to give to my friends. I share to give to people who have given to me. I share with people who need it because they don't have food. So that's why I share. People also cited other motives which have been, considered or mentioned by theorists, but are often less, discussed in, the hunter-gatherer context, such as normativity. This is the Hadza way. This is what we do. We share our food. This is why I do it. Or I do it out of pleasure, or I do it because of other people's virtues. They're deserving of the food. So there appear to be other social and cultural factors that are important here. The other interesting thing to note is that only 2 individuals, both of them men, said that they share due to complaints from others. And nobody mentioned this. They hunt or they gather because other people will complain if they don't, as a motivation. It's hard to say anything, really conclusively about gender differences because we have small samples here. There were no gender differences for any of the foraging, why do you hunt, why do you gather motivations. Again, small samples, but we do see some differences here for appeals to virtue. So women gave more personal virtue motivations. I share because I'm a good person. And they listed, friendship or familiarity as like I know them as a sharing motive more than men did. We next asked them 7 yes/no questions along with those relevant illustrations for every one of them. So we explained each motive category again, and then we asked the participants whether it ever applied to them. Did they ever do these behaviors because of that motivation? Question order was the same here for all the participants. So our yes/no task suggests that people just endorsed all motive categories. And in fact, you can see the proportion of yes answers here was, so overwhelming that, we should interpret it with some caution. The good news is that there were 28 no's in total, only with one exception, the no's were, evenly distributed among participants, which gives us some suggestion or indication or confidence that they probably did understand the task. And this data is also consistent with the free response test. They just named a lot of different things. People said a lot of different things. So this isn't that surprising that they said, yeah, this could be a reason why I hunt, or could be a reason why I share. We next conducted the ranking task. Again, we reviewed every motive with them and then asked the participants to select the picture that they considered the most important in motivating their behavior. And then we removed that picture, and then we repeated the question, and we did this 3 times. And we really only did it 3 times. We didn't want them to rank every one of them just to avoid participant fatigue. So this is actually the whole study was very long for the Hadza. So we just collected the top 3 of the 7 options. And as I mentioned earlier, the probabilities that of participants listing each of the 7 potential sharing motives as a top 3 motive, we estimated that using binomial regressions. And then one of the reasons why we chose top 3 rather than simply just the first ranked category, we analyzed that. We wanted to just maximize our sample of responses here. So these are all the different foraging motivations, for instance. Here are our ridge plots showing weighted average posterior probability densities for those 7 different motives, and then the probability of them being chosen as a top 3, and we just disaggregated them by gender on this one. And what you can clearly see is, why do you hunt, why do you gather? Family provisioning came out on top, skill signaling and sharing. They were the 3 most important motivators for foraging effort, and both men and women. They were selected above chance, which is this dotted line here. And also complaints, again, down here, I hunt and gather because if I don't, people will complain, scored the lowest for both men and women. So family, I do it so people can see that I'm skilled, and I do it so that I can share with people. Food, top 3 for both men and women. Despite the similarities and overlap, there are gender differences here that you can see. So we found statistically real sex differences in responses that were exactly in line with those classic predictions of costly signaling. So women were more likely to highlight family provisioning compared to men. Men were more likely to highlight skill signaling compared to women. And then self-provisioning, there was also a difference here. So why do you forage? I forage to get myself food. Why do you hunt? Well, they're less likely to say I hunt for myself, which is consistent with what we see. Foraged foods are more often kept by women and consumed by women and their children. But again, despite these sex differences, overall, men and women's responses were more similar than they were different. So again, the evidence, just like the carnival game study that I showed you, it's a little bit mixed here. We find support for costly signaling and family provisioning. And then also I foraged to share with other individuals, all above chance. Okay. And then here are the results for sharing motivations. So why do you share outside your household? And the data here are just collapsed across men and women because we don't see any gender differences. Again, you can see all the models in the paper, but reciprocity, rot, and generosity. I share to be generous, to show that I'm generous. I share because the food will rot otherwise, or I share in order so that other people will share with me in the future. All scored significantly above chance. But reciprocity, it outperformed all other sharing motivations here. So I share food with others because if I share now, they will share food with me later. And then finally, we have our forced choice task where we selected pairs of pictures and we asked participants to indicate which of the two motives was more important to them. And what we did is we selected 3 forced choices for foraging and then 4 forced choices for sharing. And we narrowed these down again so as not to overwhelm participants. This was a very long study. And we just chose the ones that we thought were most important for distinguishing between the different theories, though we certainly didn't capture everything that we wanted. So let me just run this by you, and these will be the last results that I share. So the majority of men and women chose sharing as more important as a motivation for foraging than, avoiding complaints from others. The vast majority of participants also chose family provisioning versus giving food to attractive members of the opposite sex as a reason, and there was no gender difference there. Where we do see a small gender difference is in the choice between I forage or I hunt in order to share food with others versus provision myself. It's not surprising given the ranking data that I shared with you. Men are more likely to say share with others, where women are less likely to say share with others, more likely to provision for themselves. And then in decisions to share outside the household, we see, again, reciprocity being chosen much more than complaints in both men and women. Reciprocity was also selected more than sharing with members of, attractive members of the opposite sex, again, by both men and women. And then, slightly more than half of participants reported that generosity signaling was a more important motive than skill signaling. And more men said, slightly more men said that than women. Where we do see a little bit of a gender differences in this last one, it's complaints. Like I'm sharing with people outside of my household due to complaints. Men were less likely to say that, more likely to say, I want to share with attractive members of the opposite sex, where for women, it was pretty split. So just to summarize the findings quickly, many of the motives generated by theorists were endorsed by participants and often independently mentioned in the free response task. Men and women's responses, they were more similar than they were different, but there were some clear gender differences in foraging motives, which are predicted by that show-off hypothesis. Reciprocity was just an important motivation for sharing, or important motivation across every single one of the sharing questions that we asked. And then complaints and requests scored low in every task. This was true for both, the foraging and sharing questions. It was only mentioned, I think, twice in the free response task, and in the ranking task, it was mentioned. It was ranked the lowest. It was, if you remember, endorsed. Everything was endorsed, but in the yes and no task. But it was actually one of the common categories for those rare no responses. And this was surprising to us because, there is an extensive literature on demand sharing. So there could be social desirability effects here. Or it just might be that, complaints are a reason sometimes share, but it just ranks really low compared to other motivations. And then finally, There were a lot of reasons given in the free response data, including categories that we hadn't included in the other tasks. So norms, this is the odds away. I'm doing it to help, those in need. Appeals to virtue, I do it because I'm a good person. I do it because those people deserve it, just to name a few. So lots of different reasons. Quickly, limitations, some I already mentioned. Social desirability effects could have skewed the results. There may also be problems with interpretation here. So even though we explained each motive carefully and repeatedly over and over, we used first order beliefs. So why do you do this? We used pictures to help facilitate comprehension, straightforward, simple wording. But due to the length of the entire study, we didn't do any, we didn't include comprehension checks to make sure participants really understood the questions. We did do some checks for internal validity. They can be found in the paper. So for instance, we found that if participants ranked a motive category higher in the ranking task, they were more likely to choose that in the forced choice task. So that was reassuring. Of course, it doesn't, prove that every participant understood every motive perfectly, but, it just gives us confidence in our general findings. And then we also just didn't ask any follow-up questions. Again, it was just very long interviewing. So we can't really fully know how participants interpreted different aspects of the study. So what do they really think foraging skill meant? Or how did they understand complaints from other individuals? One big takeaway or argument that we could possibly make from this is that, this pervasive tendency to share food or just our, tendency to cooperate more generally among humans is, I think, probably not attributable to a single evolutionary mechanism. And this is akin to arguments that have been made by Mike Girvin and Kim Hill that have said that food redistribution is probably multi-causal. It's flexible. It, can change and vary based on circumstance. So our propensity to share, at least from this study, is influenced by lots of different motivations, from kinship and reciprocity to social norms to perceptions of our own morality. So rather than trying to pinpoint a single dominant, theory that explains our other regarding preferences and, widespread cooperation in our species, it may be more insightful to view these multiple motivations as something that is, distinct in humans, that it's, actually a derived feature of our psychology and something that separates us from our closest relatives. Okay, before I close, and I promise I'm wrapping up now, I just want to quickly circle back and say something about the methods. Yes, of course, there are lots of good reasons that scientists should be cautious when handling self-assessments of motives. This was the list that I provided earlier of, limitations of self-report data. But I think what this means is that we should interpret self-report data with caution, but it doesn't mean we should just give up on it completely or neglect it altogether. As I mentioned, there are really good reasons to talk to participants. So a growing number of anthropologists, for ethical reasons, are calling for increased participant involvement in research and giving participants their own voice in how they're written about, how they're portrayed. And I think participant self-assessments represent a step toward this goal. But more than, these ethical imperatives, there are good, scientific reasons to ask people about what motivates them. So first, direct assessments, as I mentioned earlier, they just tap into a wealth of local knowledge, which is, again, just so important in cross-cultural research because, us like non-local researchers, we can just lack that critical contextual knowledge. There are just a lot of things that we, borrowing from Donald Rumsfeld, there are potentially unknown unknowns, right? There are things that we don't know. And then finally, unless there are compelling reasons not to, we should probably just assume that people can provide reasonable explanations for their own motivations. So yeah, there might be instances where individuals might fabricate, or it might be, adaptive to deceive yourself. There's also reason to think that there's a significant adaptive advantage to understanding what motivates you, what motivates other people to do things. And this is particularly true for crucial evolutionarily relevant activities like sharing of food or foraging of food. And in these areas, participants are likely to have already thought about their motives and are probably able to offer informed opinions. And I think the fact that our self-report data just overlapped with many researcher attributed motivations and even just expanded, it went beyond that, provides evidence for that. So I would just say that, interviews, self-report data should, very often be a starting point for investigating psychological phenomena and testing, theories, especially when it's cross-cultural research that we're talking about. Okay, last slide. So aside from, limitations, I do think that there's potentially another reason why self-report isn't used more frequently. So several researchers have, criticized the over-reliance on quantitative and experimental methods in anthropology and psychology. So for instance, my colleague, Paul Rosen, he suggests that, anthropology and psychology, they're considered softer sciences. And because of that, there's a tendency for researchers to overcompensate for that designation with what he calls quantitative peacocking. So a little bit more showing off here. And then similarly, anthropologist Clark Barrett has pointed out that, there's an imbalance now in evolutionary anthropological research with just a lot of emphasis on quantified data that we might not really know what it means, and just not enough context. And I think this issue is partly fueled by, the pressures that us researchers face to develop, new methods, more sophisticated methods. And this can lead to, methodologies that are good, but often methodologies that are just flashy for the sake of being flashy. And they can overshadow simpler, basic approaches like just asking. And that's it. So I'll leave the screen on just in case I need to revisit any slides, but I'm happy to take some questions. I realize I went over a little bit, so